Marnie Gable, a veteran chorister with a skeptical gaze and a worn soul, recounts a harrowing near-death experience caused by advanced pneumonia. After collapsing during a choir rehearsal, Marnie died for 22 minutes. In that void, she was stripped of her blue hospital gown and wire-rimmed glasses to face a Jesus who was not a gentle shepherd, but a roaring lion. Let's hear her story.
99% of the worship rising from our sanctuaries today hits the ceiling and falls back down as judgment. My name is Marnie Gable. I've spent 20 years in the choir loft, looking down at congregations through my wire-rimmed glasses, thinking we were the holy ones. 12 days ago, I died for 22 minutes due to complications from severe, untreated pneumonia. And during those 22 minutes, Jesus showed me the terrifying reality of what he calls the auditorium of earth. Today he revealed that out of millions of churches around the world, every church you and I have ever performed in, only 3 types are actually heard in heaven. The rest are leading you into a fire that never goes out. I know this sounds impossible. I know this sounds harsh coming from a woman in a hospital bed. But after what Jesus showed me behind the curtain, I can never play pretend again. If you're sitting in your pew thinking your choir robes make you holy, you need to hear this because your eternal soul is hanging by a thread. But before I share the terrifying vision of the 3 true churches, please tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? It helps to know we are not alone in this battle. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel right now. It helps us push these warnings out to a dying world before it's too late. Now listen closely. It was a Sunday morning in November when the curtain finally fell. I was standing in the choir loft preparing for my solo, when suddenly a crushing weight settled in my lungs. The severe pneumonia I had ignored for weeks, hiding my fever under my heavy robes, finally struck me without warning. One moment I was reaching for a high note. The next moment I was on the carpet, clutching my chest, struggling to breathe as the sanctuary lights dimmed into darkness. The paramedics worked on me for what seemed like hours, but I later learned it was exactly 22 minutes. 22 minutes when my heart stopped beating. When my brain showed no activity. When doctors declared me clinically dead. But those 22 minutes changed everything I thought I knew about worship, about performance, and about the noise we make in God's name. When the darkness of the ambulance lifted, I found myself standing in a place that words cannot describe. It wasn't a hospital, and I was no longer wearing the blue gown or the chaotic mix of sweat and two-toned hair. The silence here was absolute. It was more real than any hymn I had ever sung. The light didn't come from stage fixtures, but from a presence that stripped me bare. I thought I would see angels or hear a heavenly choir. Instead, as I stood in that terrifying void, the first sound I heard wasn't a welcome home. It was a low, vibrating growl coming from behind me. A sound so primal it made my spirit tremble. I turned around, expecting a monster, but what I saw shattered every religious picture I had ever hung on my wall. And what he said to me made me wish I had never stepped foot on a stage. For 20 years, the choir loft was my sniper's nest. From that elevated platform, I could see everything. Mrs. Higgins checking her watch during the sermon, Deacon Miller hiding his phone during the offering, and the teenagers asleep in the back row. I adjusted my wire-rimmed glasses, looking down my nose at them, judging their hypocrisy while smoothing the front of my velvet robe. I convinced myself that my judgment was discernment, that my voice was the only pure thing in a sanctuary full of static. But looking back, I was just another actor in the production, and my costume was about to become my burial shroud. That Sunday morning, the air in the sanctuary felt impossibly thin, or maybe it was just my lungs drowning in their own fluids. I had been fighting what I called a bad cold for 3 weeks, refusing to see a doctor because the seasonal cantata was coming up and I had the solo. Vanity is a cruel, demanding master. Under the layers of heavy burgundy velvet, my body was an oven. Cold sweat trickled down my neck, matting my hair, that chaotic two-toned mess of dark regrowth and bleached blonde ends, against my feverish forehead. I felt like I was cooking from the inside out, every breath catching on a rattle that I tried desperately to mask with peppermint lozenges and sheer willpower. When the choir director nodded at me to step forward, I forced a tight, practiced smile. I gripped the oak railing, my knuckles turning white, trying to steady a room that was beginning to tilt violently to the left. I took a deep breath, ignoring the stabbing pain in my ribs, and opened my mouth to sing the high note of the bridge. It was a note I had hit 1,000 times before. But this time, instead of a clear, bell-like tone, a wet, gurgling wheeze escaped my lips. The silence that followed was absolute and horrifying. I saw the director's eyes go wide, reflecting my own terror, and then the floor rushed up to meet me. I didn't feel the impact of the carpet. I only felt the crushing weight of the water in my chest, sealing my airways like fast-drying concrete. The sanctuary lights blurred into a single blinding halo before fading into an oppressive gray. The next thing I knew, I was being jostled rhythmically in the back of an ambulance. My expensive velvet robe had been sliced away, replaced by the indignity of a flimsy blue hospital gown that felt less like clothing and more like a body bag. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was a prisoner in a body that had finally quit on me. The siren wailed, but it sounded miles away, muffled by the thick fog consuming my mind. I tried to focus on the paramedic's face, but his features were melting. As the paramedics ripped my blouse open to attach the leads, the last thing I heard wasn't a prayer, but a terrifying growl coming from the corner of the ambulance. The growl didn't come from a beast, but from the violent tearing of the veil between worlds. In a blink, the ambulance, the frantic paramedics, and the screaming siren evaporated. The suffocating pressure in my chest vanished, replaced by a vacuum of silence so absolute it felt heavy. I wasn't in a hospital. I was standing on a precipice of glass, suspended in a void that was neither day nor night. And I wasn't alone. I had spent my life singing about the Lamb of God, picturing a gentle shepherd with soft eyes and a comforting embrace. But the figure standing before me was not the Jesus of my Sunday school pamphlets. He was the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he was not smiling. His eyes were reservoirs of rotating fire, burning with a holiness so intense it felt like it was incinerating the wire-rimmed glasses right off my face. He didn't look at me. He looked through me, bypassing my choir robes and my years of service, seeing the skepticism and pride I had nursed in the dark corners of my heart. I fell to my knees not out of piety but out of sheer terror. "Stand, Marnie," he said. His voice sounded like the rushing of many waters, vibrating through my spirit. "You wanted to judge my church. Now see it as I see it." He swept his hand across the darkness and suddenly the void below us lit up. It looked like a sprawling cityscape at night, millions of lights flickering in the gloom. "The auditorium of Earth," he declared. But as my vision adjusted, I realized I wasn't looking at skyscrapers. I was looking at churches. From the outside, they were blindingly bright, neon crosses buzzing like beer signs, strobe lights flashing from sanctuaries, massive screens illuminating the night. But then the Lord touched my eyes and the physical light died. The view shifted to spiritual reality. The scene went pitch black. "They have lights but no lamp," he whispered, the sorrow in his voice terrifying. "They have noise but no sound." I watched as the roof of a familiar building peeled back. It was my own church. I saw Pastor Oswin in the pulpit. In the physical, he was sweating, shouting, holding the microphone like a weapon of righteousness. But in the spirit, he was alone on a dark stage, admiring his reflection in a mirror that hovered before him. He wasn't preaching to save souls. He was preening, intoxicated by the sound of his own voice. I saw Silas, our worship leader, strumming his guitar with his eyes closed in apparent ecstasy. But spiritually he was hooked up to an four drip, feeding on the adrenaline of the crowd's applause, utterly disconnected from the throne room. They were performers starring in plays written by their own egos. Jesus pointed to a megachurch I had always admired, a place I secretly wished I could join because of its massive choir and perfect acoustics. "Look closer at the pulpit," he commanded. I leaned in, expecting to see a great man of God. Instead, Jesus said, "Look closer at the pulpit." What I saw crawling around the pastor's feet made my spirit vomit. "That thing," I gasped, watching a translucent slimy serpent coil around the famous pastor's ankles. It was feeding on the adoration of the crowd, growing fatter with every round of applause while the pastor wiped his brow with a silk handkerchief. "That is the God they actually serve," Jesus said, his voice low and dangerous. "They have built temples to their own talents. Marnie, listen to me. I hate this noise. It is the sound of brass striking brass, hollow and dead. It does not rise, it rots." He looked at me with eyes that incinerated my excuses. "For years, you confused emotional manipulation for my presence. You felt a chill down your spine when the key changed, when the lights dimmed, when the chord resolved perfectly, and you called it the Holy Ghost. But that was not me. That was biology. You were being entertained, not sanctified. You were addicted to the goosebumps, but you remained unchanged in your heart." The realization hit me harder than the pneumonia ever had. I thought of every solo I had fought for, every time I held a high note just a second longer to ensure the congregation was looking at me. I wasn't leading worship, I was stealing glory. I was a thief in a velvet robe, taking the praise meant for the Creator and hoarding it for my own vanity. I realized then that the spirit of theater had replaced the Spirit of God in almost every sanctuary I knew. We wanted a show because a show is safe. A show doesn't ask you to die to yourself. I saw millions of souls falling into darkness because they were too proud to admit their church was a social club. Don't let your pride be the reason you scroll past the subscribe button right now. If you can't even commit to hearing the truth on this channel, how will you commit to the truth when judgment comes? Tell me in the comments why you're afraid to click subscribe. Is it because you don't want to be convicted? I stood there trembling, stripped of my pride, expecting him to cast me into the outer darkness with the performers. I deserved it. I was just as guilty as the man with the serpent on his leg. But instead of striking me down, he did something unexpected. He turned away from the dazzling skyline of megachurches and cathedrals, rejecting the neon crosses and the expensive steeples. Then the Lord turned his back on the millions of lights and walked toward a dark, forgotten alleyway. He said, "Come, Marnie. Let me show you where I actually live." We followed the alleyway past the back doors of the great cathedrals, stepping over the trash that the religious world had thrown out. Jesus led me to a building that looked like it had been condemned years ago. There was no sign out front, no greeters with fake smiles, and definitely no coffee bar in the lobby. Inside, the room was a stifling box with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry hornets. There was no air conditioning, only the thick, heavy heat of bodies pressed together on rusted metal folding chairs. "Watch," Jesus commanded. At the front, behind a podium that looked like it was salvaged from a dumpster, stood a man the Lord called Brother Cale. He didn't look like a pastor. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt and looked exhausted, lacking the polished televangelist shine I was used to. He didn't tell jokes to warm up the crowd. He didn't promise them a financial breakthrough if they sowed a seed. He simply opened a worn leather-bound Bible and began to read. His words were not comforting. They were jagged. He spoke of sin, of the narrow gate, and of the cost of discipleship. In my choir loft, we would have fired him for being too divisive. We wanted sermons that felt like a warm bath. Brother Cale was throwing ice water. He read verses that offended the flesh, scriptures that demanded the death of the ego. I looked at the congregation expecting them to walk out. But nobody moved. There was no cheering, no performative amens, and no raising of hands to be seen by others. Instead, I saw a young man in the second row gripping the back of the chair in front of him until his knuckles turned white. I saw an older woman weeping silently into her hands, her shoulders shaking not with ecstasy, but with the profound grief of repentance. They weren't being entertained, they were being operated on. "This is the church of the pierced heart," Jesus whispered, and for the first time his voice held a note of tenderness. "They do not gather to feel good about themselves. They gather to be cut. My word is a sword, Marnie, not a feather. In your church you put bandages on cancer and called it healing. Here they open the wound so the infection can be removed." I felt a sudden desperate longing to sit in one of those rusted chairs. I wanted that truth. I wanted to feel that holy pain that proves you are spiritually alive, rather than the numb comfort of the theater. I wanted to stay there in that holy conviction, but Jesus pulled me away. He said, "You must see how my body works, not just how it speaks." The scene dissolved from the stifling room of conviction to a hallway that smelled of urine, boiled cabbage, and despair. We were no longer in a church in any traditional sense. We were inside a crumbling apartment complex, the kind of place where the elevator has been broken for a decade and the walls sweat with humidity. Jesus didn't stop to admire the architecture. He walked straight through a battered door into a dimly lit efficiency unit. Here there were no Bibles open. There was no worship music playing in the background. There was only the sound of running water and labored breathing. "Look," Jesus said, pointing to the center of the room. I saw a woman, perhaps in her 50s, kneeling on the linoleum floor beside a stained mattress. On the mattress lay a young man, skeletal and shivering, his skin gray and clammy. He was an addict in the throes of withdrawal or worse. In my world, we would have prayed for him from a safe distance, or perhaps organized a food drive where we dropped off cans without making eye contact. But this woman was holding his foot. With a rag dipped in a basin of warm, soapy water, she was gently cleaning the open, weeping sores on his legs. The smell was atrociously sour, making me want to cover my nose, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't wearing a volunteer t-shirt with the church logo. There was no camera crew documenting her kindness. There was no smartphone propped up on a tripod to capture the moment for Instagram or TikTok. There was absolutely no audience for this act of love except for the cockroaches skittering along the baseboards and the God of the universe standing beside me. "This is the church of the calloused hand," the Lord declared. "My people have become obsessed with the platform, but the kingdom is built on the floor. You think worship is raising your hands in a sanctuary. I tell you, worship is getting your hands dirty in the mud." I looked at my own hands, soft, manicured, used only for turning pages of sheet music and holding microphones. Then I looked at hers, red, chapped and rough. She wasn't preaching a sermon to this dying boy. She was the sermon. She was touching the leper while the rest of us were just singing about healing. I realized with a sickening thud in my gut that service without anonymity isn't service at all. It's just PR. I thought this was the highest form of love, but Jesus shook his head and said, "There is one more church. The one that keeps the world from ending tonight." The final descent took us deep underground, far beneath the noise of the street and the hypocrisy of the steeples. We entered a damp, windowless basement that smelled of stale air and old carpet. There was no furniture here, only a single threadbare rug stained with the evidence of many battles. Lying face down on that rug were two people. An elderly woman with arthritis twisting her hands, and a young man in a hoodie who looked like he should be out causing trouble, not saving the world. They weren't speaking in tongues or shouting at the devil. They were groaning. It was a guttural, agonizing sound, like a mother birthing a child or a man grieving a death. Their bodies were frail. Jesus told me they hadn't eaten in 3 days, but their spirits were giants. Above the basement ceiling, the sky was raining arrows of fire. I saw judgments, accidents, and demonic assignments falling like hail toward the city. But just before they hit the rooftops, they shattered against an invisible dome of glass that radiated from this basement. "This is the church of the unseen tear," Jesus said, his voice trembling with emotion. "They do not ask for blessings. They stand in the gap. They are the dam holding back the flood of my wrath. If they stop praying, Marnie, your city falls by morning. These are my breath." I realized then that the safety I enjoyed, the peace I took for granted, was paid for by the hunger and tears of people I would have ignored in the grocery store. I reached out to touch the old woman's shoulder to thank her, but the moment my finger grazed her, the floor dropped out from under me. I fell through the void, screaming until I slammed back into my body with the violence of a car crash. The silence of heaven was shattered by the frantic beeping of machines. My eyes flew open, stinging with sweat, and I gasped, sucking in a lungful of sterile hospital air that tasted like chemicals. My hair was matted to my skull and my chest felt like it had been kicked by a mule. I was back in the blue gown. Back in the world of noise. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive. I say I was sent back to warn you. If you leave this video without subscribing or sharing it, you are essentially walking back into the burning building I just escaped from. Do not be the person who hears the alarm and goes back to sleep. If you choose to ignore this, write in the comments, "I choose to sleep." Let the world see your choice. I tried to sit up, coughing up the last of the fluid that had drowned me. A nurse rushed over, checking the monitors with a look of disbelief. The monitor started beeping again, proving I was alive. But as I looked at the nurse adjusting my I noticed something hovering over her shoulder that proved the war had followed me back.